Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay or Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Henrietta Treyz joins us. She's a managing partner at Veda Partners. She's the one that really gives us a sense of kind of what's happening on this election and on the political side and how it might affect markets here. Henrietta, as David was just mentioning, he's going to be out there in the field trying to get a sense of how this is going to play out over the next week or so. What is your sense between now and Election Day, Henrietta? Is there anything that might move the needle one way or the other, or are we pretty much where we are?
We're seeing a lot of really robust turnout from Republicans in rural areas right now. That's the main theme of the last week of early voting. So in states like Nevada, I'm confident saying, this is a very bad position for Democrats to be in the state of Nevada, which is a critical swing state. But it's not necessarily translating elsewhere yet. That's because different states have different voting patterns and in-person early regulations, like the state of Pennsylvania, for example. So there's a lot of shift, but this week is really an integral one to watch. You want to watch the suburban vote and the youth vote. Those demographics disproportionately start voting this week. Before, it had been principally an older white rural voter. And a lot of that is Republicans cannibalizing their election day vote from 2020. So this week should give us some new information to see whether it's going to be a scenario where Democrats continue to stay home, as they did during the first week of early voting, or if they're going to start coming out, which would be disproportionately, again, your urban, suburban, and younger voters, which is a demographic that this cycle is skewing Democratic, particularly on the suburban side, which I think is where we should really be focused.
Henrietta, help me understand the metamorphosis of the Republicans as it comes to the early vote, because it was something that during the last presidential election, the one before that, Donald Trump was not an enthusiast for. He was not encouraging his supporters to vote early. What has changed, and sort of how does it or how could it affect what we see after Election Day in terms of the way in which Republicans in particular look at these votes as they're tallied?
Yeah, and it really does need to change. Otherwise, Democrats are going to get wiped out across the swing states. So right now, what we're seeing is a material shift from 2020 in terms of early voting. And this is a result, the metamorphosis comes from millions of dollars in Republican Party operation explanations or sort of explainers to voters that you should vote early in person. So Republicans are disproportionately voting early in person, whereas Democrats have an advantage in the mail-in ballot. So to get really granular for you, the voters out in Nevada who are able to vote early in person are doing so in rural areas. But then you have Clark County, where there's the disproportionate share of Democrats and 90% of the electorate. And they mostly vote via mail-in ballot that now all Nevadans get. So there's a lot of granular changes that have happened since 2020. But the rule of thumb is that Republicans now are voting in person early, where Democrats are favoring mail-in balloting early. And as I mentioned, this week is when a lot of the youth vote will go and vote in person early. But there is an indication that we'll have less of a blue wall going into Election Day, but also less of a red wave on Election Day, again, because they're voting early at about double the rate Democrats are. So it is going through quite a bit of a shift and creating a lot of problems for people like me who are obviously trying to track against a very difficult comp year in 2020, which was a pandemic anyway.
Is any party, any particular more advantage or less advantage in getting out the vote?
When it comes to ground game, I think it's clear that the Democrats have a better ground game, something like 326 field offices nationwide, where the Trump campaign famously does not disclose its numbers. I think the Trump camp has farmed out a lot of its get out the vote to third party campaigns. The penultimate example would be Elon Musk, auctioning off $1 million to voters who register. That's an example of a third party campaign, sort of in-kind donation, whereas Democrats are doing that within the campaign structure. So in terms of field offices, I want to say they have like 12 just in the state of Florida, for example, and then tens of thousands of volunteers that have signed on since Kamala Harris joined the race. So that's the difference in the field operation. But the Democrats' job is harder now because more Republicans have voted early. And you want to bank those votes, not because they're any more or less important, but you don't want to have to worry about more people on Election Day in terms of getting people out to vote.
You bring up Elon Musk. He was in New York City yesterday for this 6-hour-long rally that Donald Trump put on at Madison Square Garden, and he talked about what he might be able to cut if Donald Trump were to win, and he were named to this new position, which I checked the name of here. This is the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. Another crypto allusion there from Elon Musk. Curious what you heard from that rally so much as you listened to it. And I just think back on the conversation that we had with you last week or the week before just about this rally. It was kind of couched as maybe a bit of a vanity project for Donald Trump coming back to New York, which is where he'd lived and had kind of spurned him in recent years. Now we're really seeing what could be kind of damaging legacy from some of the comments that were made there at that event. Should he be worried about how they're reverberating, how those clips are kind of spreading across this country?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a New Yorker myself. You do not come for Puerto Rico. That's not something that I would advise. And you're seeing members from the senators to the House members, including even the Trump campaign, try to distance themselves from the comedian who called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. I mean, that's just not workable. 600,000 Puerto Ricans in the state of Pennsylvania, where you're going to go right outside of Philly. That's a problem. And you can't really have that. Bad Bunny then coming out and endorsing, J-Lo coming out and endorsing. I mean, this is New York pride in its fullest. And you have the fate of the House of Representatives riding on some swing seats in the House in New York City and in New York State and the surrounding regions. So that right there is a problem. But you mentioned Elon Musk. And I think that his understanding of what can be cleaned up is sort of a canard. The members always say, we can trim fraud, waste, and abuse. That's been since I ever got to DC, it's roughly $300 billion. And I believe last night Elon Musk said that it was $2 trillion. So you're not even playing the same sport at this point. Now, there is not $2 trillion to cut. That's the entire budget of the entire federal government for the entire year. So it's just not real numbers that he is referencing. And DOGE would be responsible, if you want to call it that, for cutting
if we have to. Yeah.
It's not you're not playing with real numbers.
Henrietta, what's the call here? What's the feeling? What's the consensus about some of the down ballot voting here at this stage?
My expectation is that Republicans are going to win the United States Senate. I bet at 90% odds of that for the entire year. And I feel very comfortable with that. Montana, Ohio, Pennsylvania are all very disconcerting races for Democrats right now. You're going to go interview Tammy Baldwin. I know she's concerned up there as well. They're really fighting for all the turnout. In general, if you want like a whole lay of the land, state of the race, Nevada looks very bad for Democrats. Republicans are outperforming. You got the urban voters who are rural voters who are coming out in droves in terms of the get out the vote campaign. Arizona has less read through, but also looks very promising for Republicans right now. And in Pennsylvania and in North Carolina, it also looks pretty good for Republicans right now. So Democrats have to crush this next week of early voting in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and then see how Souls to the Polls did in Georgia yesterday. I haven't had a chance to look at that data, but you want to see what the voter turnout is in suburban areas in all of those states. But Democrats have an incumbency problem of getting all those voters out now that Republicans can be a little bit restful about because they've turned out so many members in droves over the last couple weeks of early voting, and it's disproportionately looking very good for them in states like Nevada.
Henrietta, thanks so much for the latest there. Henrietta Treyz, managing partner at Veda Partners. She is all over this election news and analysis from the presidential election all the way down to the local races in the House and Senate. We appreciate getting some of her time.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube. 8
days to the election. I guess here from the perspective of Bloomberg, a lot of the discussion is, what the economic policies of either candidate might mean for this domestic economy and the global economy. We pose that to Hugh Johnson, Chairman, Hugh Johnson Economics. Hugh, thanks so much for joining us here. What are you telling your clients here 8 days out to the election about what is an election? It's probably too close to call here, but how should they be thinking about it? What are you telling your clients?
Well, it's really complex and obviously very difficult to talk about because it's very difficult to understand. Really what it comes down to, first of all, people should start to start thinking about what's going to happen after the election, regardless of who gets elected. Now, I know the projection polls are suggesting that maybe Trump has a slight edge. So part of what we're talking about is what we might see if Trump is elected. But quite frankly, it's not going to be much different. It's a close call on the election. We all kind of know that. We can't predict who's going to win. So you got to think about both. When it comes to economic policy, and it's going to be very important in my judgment when we get into the next administration, it really comes down to taxes and trade policy or tariffs. And when it comes to taxes, the number one focus of, I think, both, and I think of all of us, should be on really tax policy. And really what we're talking about is trying to get an extension of the 2017 tax reductions in the marginal rate, increase in standard deductions, higher exemptions for gift taxes, as well as estate taxes. But basically trying to get an extension of the 2017 tax reductions, which sunset or expire at the end of 2025. And what we've learned when in 2018 and 19, when we had the initial passage of those 2017 reductions, is, first of all, you're going to obviously see, and this is really predictable, a decline in corporate income tax revenues at the federal level, and, as you might guess, meaningful increases in deficits, meaningful increases in the U.S. debt. If you look at the Congressional Budget Office, they'll tell you over 10 years, if we pass the 2017 tax reductions, you'll get about a $3 trillion increase in the federal debt deficits, and about a $467 billion increase in interest payments by the federal government. We got to get that money from somewhere, and that's when we have a collision between tax policy, the increase in deficits, and then trade policy, tariffs, when you start to get increases in tariffs. We should talk about that.
Well, let's talk a bit about it. And, I've been noticing, as I'm sure you have, how little conversation there has been about the size of deficits and sort of what this might mean. There aren't many fiscal hawks left in Washington these days, it seems like. But you bring up this kind of convergence of, yes, the potential continuation of those Trump tax cuts and these tariffs policies. We heard the former president last night here in New York at Madison Square Garden making the case, as he has before, specious as it might be, that you could do away with taxes and just have tariffs pay for everything. The numbers here tell a different story.
Yeah, they do. And the most important thing is, if you do get, first of all, they're very wedded to reducing taxes or basically extending the 2017 tax policies, tax reductions. So that's very important. Now, the question is, okay, how are you going to pay for them? The way you pay for them is the way we've always paid for them. A lot of it comes from households, but a significant portion of what we pay for, as far as the deficit's concerned, is from foreign investors. Now, if you do have increased taxes or tariffs, roughly 10 to 20% universal baseline tax increases, you've heard about 60% on imports from China. You've heard about specific taxes on things like automobiles from Mexico, 100%. Increases in tariffs, that's not going to endear those folks that are getting, those countries that are getting increased taxes or increased tariffs. That's not going to endear them to financing our federal deficits. So it's going to get a lot more difficult to finance those deficits as we move through the next 10 years. Very difficult. What does that mean? That probably means you're going to have to offer higher interest rates to get that done, and higher interest rates is likely to have some weight on the outcome for the economy. And I would add, and I hesitate to add this, if you look back at the Great Depression of 1929 to 1939, one of the principal reasons that we had that depression was because we had such significant tariffs. Remember the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which led the U.S. economy, the world economy, quite frankly, into a depression. So the point being is very simple. If you reduce taxes, You get a big deficit, you get a big debt, has to be financed. A lot of it gets financed by foreign investment or capital flows, and they're not going to be happy about it if we're imposing, at the same time, we're imposing significant tariffs on them. So this is what I'm just simply saying, is that when we move into the next administration, either one, when we move into the next administration, the risks are going to get a little bit higher and they have to be watched very carefully. Things are good now, but we've got to watch them very carefully as we move into the next administration. I hope that's clear. This is not an easy subject to understand.
Hugh, what is your view of the current economic situation here in the U.S.? It seems like GDP, still pretty solid. Inflation coming down. Most people who want a job have jobs. Their wages are growing. What's your view of this U.S. economy right now?
It's about as good as you could possibly get. Read The Economist magazine, and they'll tell you the same thing on the recent issue. It's very good. You're absolutely right. GDP is solid. It's slowing. Employment is slowing. The economy is slowing. Personal disposable income slowing. Personal consumption slowing, but very solid. You're likely to get lower numbers after the third quarter numbers. Third quarter be around 3%, but then we'll be looking at 1.5% to 2%, fourth quarter, first quarter, second quarter of 2025. That's soft landing. And inflation will be coming down. The Federal Reserve will be reducing short-term interest rates. Long-term interest rates should be coming down under those conditions, and stock prices should be doing better. Very good. That's the good news. The not so good news, at least in my judgment, everybody sees this differently, is we're a little bit high or pricey or overvalued. That's one problem. And I'm a little bit worried that I see such widespread optimism, which means if we got a 6 to 8% correction, I would welcome it because we'd get to levels that I think would be much more attractive for investors. But Basically, when you look ahead, everything you say is correct. The outlook, prospects, the economy is really good, really solid, soft landing. I don't dismiss the case for a hard landing, but I don't think that's a very good case.
Hugh, thanks so much for joining us. As always, appreciate getting your perspective. Hugh Johnson, he's the chairman at Hugh Johnson Economics.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Let's get the latest on the developments coming out of the Middle East here. We're more than a year into this war. Jack Devine joins us. He's the founder and he's the chairman of the Arkin Group. And Jack is also a 32-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, so he has some experience in these matters. Jack, what's your latest read coming out of the Middle East here? Again, I think the most recent data point would be Iran's response to the missile attacks on Iran. They could have gone a lot broader, a lot wider, a lot deeper. They chose not to. What's your read of what's going on there in the Middle East?
Well, I think Israel has demonstrated tremendous power, and by contrast, the adversary's tremendous weakness, much less than many people anticipated. Right at this minute, I would say Israel's in the catbird seat. Their adversaries are pushing for a ceasefire. They got their back up against the wall.
I'm very curious here, sort of how you see this playing out going forward. So they're in the catbird seat, around with their back against the wall. Has this sort of tit for tat ended at this point in time? Where do you see things going here? Of course, this all kicked off with Iran attacking Israel a few weeks back.
Yeah, my read is that Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas all know that there's no bouncing back right now, right? You can only get beat up more. The fact that the Israelis went in with 100 airplanes, right? Not a single one shot down. That tells you Iran is tremendously vulnerable. The Israelis could take it up tomorrow and bomb the oil fields, bomb the nuclear sites, but they won't be able, I think, to do the damage at this point without sustained attack. But I think they've decided not to do that. Theirs was restrained. The Israelis could do more, but it was powerful. Now the Iranians are passing it off as, oh, it wasn't so bad. Well, it was pretty bad, but it didn't hit the two things. I think there was a deal made with Washington, understandable in this case. So I think they're trying to find a way to catch their breath. And I think that's true with Hezbollah. Remember, all the leadership has been wiped out of Hamas and Hezbollah. Both places have taken a tremendous beating. They need to regroup. So I think, they're going to negotiations now. Egypt and Hamas have agreements and they're discussing them. But I think, Netanyahu's sitting in a strong place. He's going to ask for a bigger price. What's that price? One will be the northern territory. The Israelis get back into it and they cease with the firing. And the hostages right up front, number one, have to be released. He's going to argue. He's holding all the cards. He's going to have a tough bargain. They could have gotten to maybe a little less a little while ago, perhaps. But right now, just because they say they want to cease fire, there'll be more on his terms. You got to watch these negotiations. It's not going to be simple. There'll be some fine print that have long-term implications.
Well, Jack, I mean, I guess my next question would be timing. If Netanyahu and Israel are in such a good place, given developments over the last several weeks, how do you think this is going to play out in terms of timing? Is this something that we could see in the next days and weeks, or is there still more posturing on either side?
Well, I think the whole world has stopped. We go through the motions until Election Day in the United States, right? Because everyone around the world is factoring in how that plays out, including in the Middle East. I think it's going to be less dramatic, except in this one place. I think the difference between the two parties may be different, at least in the short term on Iran. But I think nothing's meaningful. This is my view. I mean, there might be some last minute release of hostages or something, but I really think nothing is going to happen until after Election Day. So timing. The second thing is, I think the Israelis have now demonstrated, their effectiveness and the vulnerability of Iran. They too, I think, want the hostages. They need to regroup. I think taking out the nuclear site changes everything. So I think that was taken off the table temporarily. But let me make one final point in that. If they look like after this is over, the Iranians, despite whatever they're saying, tried to ratchet up the nuclear program, and if they get within the 6-month range, then I think we'll see much more rigorous response an effective response from Israel with our support.
Jack, I want to draw on your experience kind of observing the relationship between the U.S. and Israel over the years. And you mentioned just a few minutes ago the fact that perhaps Israel's retaliatory strike here was more limited in part because they were listening to the counsel of the administration of the United States. We've heard over the course of this conflict kind of mixed messaging about the degree to which Israel is listening to the U.S., is following the lead. Of course, that incursion into Lebanon was something that the Biden administration didn't want to have happen. What's your assessment of the quality of that relationship today, the degree to which Israel is taking the advice of the U.S. here as it pursues wars on many fronts?
I think the relationship is a really good one. It really doesn't change with administrations because our risks are so vitally intertwined. But you have to look at with Netanyahu. I mean, I know he's very controversial, including within the Israeli community, but he has run a very effective program. So he listens. He's listening, but then he recalculates it within what he thinks is possible and how much he can move us, right? So I think he's listening, but I think he's decided, I think I've got this one right. I'm gonna factor it in, but I'll factor it in unless it's contrary to what I think needs to be played here. This is true internally as well. So I think he's listening, but he's decided there's one way to handle this problem, and he's pursuing a very specific plan. If he's not going against the nuclear targets, it's because he also feels that this might be not quite the right moment, and it's opening Pandora's box, and he's not ready for it. So it's a really interesting and complex relationship, but people shouldn't get confused about who our ally is, and I don't think either administration is confused that the importance of Israel in the Middle East and stability. So I cut through the political jabbering, if you will, and I'm convinced the relationship is solid, but he's driving it with all due respect to our influence around the world. But Jack, it'll look like he's listening.
Jack, always great to get your thoughts and your perspective. Jack Devine, folks, he's a founder and chairman of the Arkin Group. He is a 32-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, where he served as both acting director and associate director of the CIA's operations outside the United States, as well as chief of the Latin American the division, the head of the CIA's Counter-Narcotics Center, and head of CIA's Afghan Task Force.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.
All right, folks, your daily look at the front pages around the world. Lisa Mateo. Wealthy Americans are paying millions to live in luxury retirement communities.
Yeah, have you thought about are you going to stay in the Jersey compound forever?
Yes. That's the plan. Staying there
There's
forever.
No chance he does it.
That's the plan, not leaving the Jersey Shore. Well, a lot of wealthy Americans, they're paying a lot of money to go to these retirement communities that are now luxury retirement communities. They're called life plan communities.
Oh boy.
The reason they're called that is because you start in an apartment and then you can move to nursing like care
or be moved,
yes, to that section. So you have one place to go because they're finding that a lot of people find it difficult to find homes for their parents once they reach that level where they have to go to nursing home status. So they're saying if you start now, then they already have that in to get there.
And
but
there's one in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right? Is that kind of what we're talking about? In Jersey, there's one where Lisa and I live. There's one that they put up like 3 or 4 towers, right?
Yeah,
wow.
It's a lot. It's a whole community. But this is like way over. I mean, you want to hear the prices for these?
Go.
Okay, so they have pools, beautiful grounds, fancy meals. An upfront payment can range from just over $1 million for one bedroom, to more than $7 million for a 3-bedroom.
Wow.
What? And then you have the monthly fees, for the amenities, $13,800 for housekeeping, valet. Yeah, so this is
another level.
like another level. This is Silicon Valley. This is the V at Palo Alto, okay? So that's what they're talking about. But, I mean, there are other places, yes, that do have these. They're not as expensive. But like I said, the baby boomers saw what their parents went through, and they don't want their kids to go through the same trouble. So that's why this is becoming popular.
Not to harp on North Carolina too much, but I mean, there are a ton of these around Duke and UNC. And a lot of people moving to the area just for them. And then you have, they draw from the universities, have all of this cultural stuff.
I mean, we did consider thinking about, the kind of retirement years. We were thinking like the greater Duke community, but it's just too far from the ocean.
Yeah.
It's too far from the ocean. So we said
Jersey Shore.
All right, very good.
Did you know there was a big celebration over the weekend for the New York City subway? 120 years old.
Wow.
Yes, it happened yesterday. Wow. A big part. The first subway train left from City Hall to 145th Street in Harlem, October 27th, 1904. Wow. It made it uptown in 26 minutes. There you go. At the time,
faster
it was
than today, I think, actually.
I was going to ask, how is that compared to today?
I ride the city subway every single day, which I've done since, 1986. It's by far the most efficient way to get around town.
Yes, that is true.
Yes.
But I don't know why people do anything different. I mean, and I'll make the claim here today. From today versus my first day in 1986, the subway experience, no change. With one big exception.
Okay.
Air-conditioned cars.
Oh, yeah.
Back in 1986, only about half the cars were air-conditioned.
Yeah.
Now they're all air-conditioned. The same grubby people, the same, everything you want to say that you don't like about the subway today is the same as it was 1986. Nothing's changed.
Status quo.
So people say it's gotten so much worse. I'm like, no, it hasn't. You haven't ridden the subway.
Well, there were grand plans to kind of modernize a lot of these stations and make things better with the money from congestion pricing, which is on hold, of course. That's the governor. So we'll see if that changes. But, there's room for improvement, I would say.
Yeah, always. But, I mean, it gets how many gajillion people around this island every day?
Back to the norm that we had pre-pandemic, I think.
Yeah, but I think what are we now? We're not. Are we back at pre-pandemic?
I think we're very close to it because
Okay.
there was that kind of trough for a while, and things were strange,
Right.
stranger on the subway. I think.
But I don't know how you get around the city. I mean, you're riding your bike? Are you doing it?
Vespa,
Uber?
get that
Yeah.
Vespa.
Exactly.
You haven't done that yet.
No, exactly right. All right, what else you got?
Okay, so New York, this is in the New York Post. Okay, so New York reportedly banned the sale of caffeine-infused cannabis. Now, caffeine-infused cannabis?
Seems to counteract one another.
Cannabis-infused caffeine?
I know. So state regulators apparently banned it. They're cannabis pills also infused with caffeine. Apparently, it's popular with fitness enthusiasts, office professionals.
You're the only fitness enthusiast.
And I'm not popping these. I don't get it.
What do you do for your energy? You're just water, or
it's just me.
it's just you? It's just Lisa Mateo.
She rides the surveillance wave.
Yes.
But apparently this is the thing. It's called Go and Genius. They're marketed as energy stimulants. But the company is appealing this ruling, so we'll see what happens. But it's been sold in New York since February of last year. But it's a big thing.
So is it different than Red Bull and stuff like that?
I guess so, because it has
Cannabis.
THC.
Because it's THC.
Ah.
Yeah,
All right.
so
The weedage. Okay.
Yeah, the weedage. Yes.
Do you have a lot of dispensaries in New Jersey? I mean,
we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess there's like 200 something in New York State, but I've noticed in Brooklyn there were a lot of these shops that have now been closed down by the sheriff. We have a sheriff apparently.
Well, yeah. I mean, it used to be in Midtown Manhattan, just within like a 3 square block of Penn Station. There were a gajillion of these things. Now they're all shut. Yeah. Within like a day. They all just, the city said no more. So, but yeah, in Jersey,
we'll figure it out.
Yeah, we go to Neptune. That's our place to go. And I'll tell you, you go to this dispensary in New Jersey, it is every walk of life. From the wealthiest retiree to the kid off the street to every color, shape, form. Yeah. It is the great equalizer. Go into the dispensary, and it's they do a great business.
That's America.
That's America.
That's America. Very good on this election year. All right, we got the World Series.
Finally, yes, World Series. Okay, so the New York Times has this interesting look when Yankees general manager Brian Cashman loved the Dodgers. I didn't realize this.
I didn't know that.
But yeah, so he told the New York Times he grew up in Lexington, Kentucky. His parents were from New York. Most of the family supported the Yankees, but he says he was the standout, the outcast. He was the Dodgers fan. And he says he doesn't really know why he was. Maybe it was because they were a great team in the 70s when he was growing up. But he just says he was a bat boy at the Dodgers for their spring training. So he was really involved with them. But, then he started working for the Yankees and things changed. So
Rich Truman's favorite general manager.
Is that right?
Really?
Oh, yeah, loves
Cashman.
And
interesting.
Coach Franklin at Penn State, Rich Truman's favorite college.
There we go. I'm learning so much here.
Exactly.
See? But I didn't know this. So he started at a college intern with the Yankees in '86. He worked his way up, assistant general manager, then general manager for the past, 27 years?
The intrigue, this article is great, but the intrigue that I loved is that Frank McCourt tried to hire him to the Dodgers from the Yankees.
Yes.
For less money.
For less money in 2005.
Or maybe more money. Maybe it was more money, but he stayed at the Yankees for less money. So I think at that point he felt like he had some Steinbrenner loyalty.
I mean, the Yankees
go back.
Yeah, the Yankees are down 2-0. They're coming back to the Bronx tonight for 3 games, I believe.
We'll see. Judge better show up.
Yeah, next 3 in New York. Thanks, Ari. And then we'll see what happens. See if they can kind of right this ship here. But after the football weekend we had with the Jets, the New York sports market needs some positive news coming out.
And Ohtani is playing, right? Can I get an update on that?
Yeah,
yes, he is. The shoulder is fine.
Yeah.
Workable. Okay, good.
Exactly right. So, all right, Lisa Mateo with the newspapers. Thank you so much. We appreciate that always.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.